Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Edric Show. I am your host, Edric Jerome. This is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, and you'll get notified of content when I post it each and every week. My guest is author Kevin B. Smith. He's the author of the new book, The Jailer's Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. The book addresses the reality that the United States imprisons more people than any other country, and that there are social, economic, and political costs to the mass incarceration of millions of people. Kevin is a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he's written extensively on topics related to criminal justice and political science. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation.
You're very welcome. Let's get into it. So, first question is, mass incarceration is it's been out there for a while, and but how did it pique your interest, and what motivated you to want to take on this gigantic subject?
There's kind of like a long backstory to that. Prior to an academic, I was a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter, and one of the beats that I covered was crime. So I have an interest going back, a number of decades in that fashion, from sort of like dealing with crime on the ground. But also, by trade, I'm a policy analyst, and one of the policies that I was analyzing back in the 1990s, early 2000s was criminal justice policy. And one of the pieces I did that still is fairly well cited today was on what explains the differences amongst states in terms of their incarceration rates, because states have very, very different rates of incarceration. And the really what drove this project was over the years, I'd get emails and phone calls out of the blue from people saying, are you going to follow up on that? Is what you explained in that original article, does that still hold true? Is any of this going to change? And, I spent the better part of a decade collecting data and reading literature to sort of like try to answer some of those questions.
One of the things you do is you dive into the history of prisons, what they were designed for originally, and where they are today. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that on just, what was the original role of prisons historically, and how has that role changed over the past few centuries, if it has?
Yeah, and in the United States, the history of prisons is fascinating because essentially America is where the original R&D was done on what we typically think of as a penitentiary today. You know, prior to the 19th century, I mean, what counted as a prison varied a lot, but in a lot of places in the United States, it wasn't even really practical to have a prison. There wasn't a dense enough population to sort of like have a dedicated facility to locking people up. And punishments were much more along the lines of, corporal punishment, or even capital punishment, social ostracism. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Red Letter, made a pretty good novel out of that. But there were some people in the United States thinking pretty deep about, how do you handle the problem of crime and social predation? And, amongst the most innovative of these thinkers were people, essentially Quakers in Pennsylvania. And they were thinking about creating institutions where people could be punished, but they could also be rehabilitated and reintegrated into society. And so they started to do things like setting up institutions where you had cellular confinement. Your meals were given to you. You were expected to do labor. You were under the supervision of uniformed guards. Essentially, all the trappings that we now associate with, any police procedure on TV. We all know what a prison looks like. But until the early part of the 19th century, these were fairly unusual things. I mean, they were considered innovative and radical. I mean, people like Charles Dickens was touring the United States and spending a lot of time in prisons, because what the United States was doing was so interesting and innovative.
The other thing that you really write well about is you write about how mass incarceration in general is primarily a state's situation because the states tend to control most of the prison and prisoners in our country. Talk a little bit about that, about the role the states play. You talked about a little bit before in your first answer, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the state's role in mass incarceration.
Yeah, sure. And I'm not sure that everyone's sort of like fully grasped the central role that state governments play in the problem of mass incarceration. People who are sitting behind bars in the United States basically fall into three buckets. There's the federal prison system, and then there are people who are like being held in local jails. And a lot of those haven't even been charged or convicted with anything. They're just sort of like in a holding pattern, waiting to make bail or what have you. But the vast majority of people sitting behind bars are in a state prison. More than 60% of the roughly 1.82 million people sitting behind bars in the United States are in a state facility. And the reason for that is fairly simple. The vast majority of criminal law in the United States is state law. And, when people commit a crime, inevitably they are being prosecuted and convicted under state criminal law. And so they end up in state institutions.
Um, you also talk about some of the very sensitive themes about mass incarceration. Obviously, we know African Americans are incarcerated at a much higher rate than everybody else. But one of the things you specified in the book is that when you started this process, you didn't approach it with any certain political leanings one way or the other. You just went right at the issue. Um, so tell me, after you finished the book, did any of your previously held thoughts change, or did anything surprise you about some of the information you were able to uncover?
Yeah, I did change some attitudes based on some of the analyses that I done. I mean, one of the things that I went into this, I guess I was one of these people who sort of like bought into the whole notion that the war on drugs was a primary driver of mass incarceration. And I walked away from the analyses not having a very different viewpoint. And part of that, I think, is true by definition. I mean, if you look at people who are incarcerated in state institutions, only about 5% of them are there for drug possession. Um, and the 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 variable that kept coming up, again and again as the strongest predictor was violent crime.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure that I would have fully predicted that it would be as strong a predictor as it was. But again, this is one of these things that's almost true by definition. Over 60% of the people who are sitting in a state prison have been convicted of a violent crime. So, I mean, it's almost true by definition. You don't need one of my statistical models to demonstrate that.
Um, Another issue of obviously with the prison system are it's big business. Mass incarceration. It's about an $80 billion a year business. Companies like, and I looked them up, Aramark, which handles a lot of things around meals and things like that for prisoners. You have Core Civic, Secures Technologies, which is a company that deals with a lot of communications between prisoners and their families and things like that. So knowing that companies like those have such a strong financial interest in maintaining a constant supply of inmates, do you think we'll see any reduction in mass incarceration as long as there's a substantial profit margin in housing, monitoring, feeding, and clothing inmates?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And again, I think part of the answer, and one of the reasons why I resist sort of like giving, just sort of like across the board answers is there's so much variation from state to state. I mean, even if you end up in prison, is dependent not just on what you do, but where you do it. And, the importance of, constituencies like for-profit prisons or, to put a different spin on it, like out in California, the prison guards are a pretty influential political constituency. Could that have some pressure on the system in terms of, keeping custodial sentences high, that sort of thing? I think it could, but I don't think that is an across the board explanation. I think the things that sort of like cut to the heart of it are things like the ideological and political climate of the state. And I'll give you a good example of this. I start out with this example in the book. There's this guy in Texas, Larry Dayries, walks into a Whole Foods and steals a tuna fish sandwich, which, I mean, nobody wants to condone lunch counter larceny, right? But I mean, he stole a tuna fish sandwich, and his sentence after he was convicted was 70 years. 70 years for stealing a tuna fish sandwich. Now, the reason that he got that sentence is he was convicted in Texas. It's a three-strike state, and that was his That was his third strike. So, it is, I took the most conservative estimates I could, and it is going to cost the taxpayers of the state of Texas at least $1 million to keep Larry Davies locked up for stealing a tuna fish sandwich. And I'm just not sure in what world that makes sense. And if you had transported Larry Davies to Maine and he had run off with a lobster roll from Whole Foods, he would not be spending 70 years in jail. And the constituents of that state would not be footing such a huge bill for a payoff that I'm not sure is worth it.
You touched upon it a little earlier. We talked a little bit about race, but I want to talk now specifically about the mass incarceration rates as it relates to African American men. And I believe, as you mentioned, Mr. Davies was African American, was he not? I believe
He
so.
was. He
Yeah.
was.
So, in all of your studies and writing the book, what were some of the things that you really or that stood out to you about why the rate of incarceration for African American men is so high, given that we're not as large a percentage of the population? Is it, I mean, obviously it's racism, of course, but speak to me a little bit more about what you saw in terms of the socioeconomic impact, the cultural impact of why African American men are being locked up at such an alarming rate.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it's news that the African American men disproportionately bear the costs of mass incarceration. But even someone who has been spending the past decade trolling through the data sets and looking at the statistics, I mean, it is still astonishing. I mean, it's really jaw-dropping. Statistically speaking, an African American male is more likely to have served a prison sentence than be left-handed or be a plumber. Over 60% of African American families have a family member that has been incarcerated. I mean, these numbers are just, I mean, they're astonishing. And they're clear evidence, and I mean, we can discuss what the causes of that, but I mean, there's clear evidence that there's something amiss socially when you have a single, fairly small demographic bearing that kind of burden in terms of the cost of incarceration, because the social and economic and even political effects are, I think, underappreciated. I mean, everybody knows that, having a felony record and serving a prison term isn't exactly a great thing to have on your CV. But serving a prison term can cut your average lifetime earnings by something like 30%. I mean, it's, even serving any kind of prison term can have that kind of effect on your lifetime income. A lot of people also end up disenfranchised. I mean, and you look at some states, Florida is kind of like the poster child for this, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book. The disenfranchisement rates of Black males in Florida is just, I mean, from a liberal democratic standpoint, it's kind of embarrassing that you can have, because I mean, it varies from year to year and from decade to decade. And academics have come up with these estimates of approximately 15%, give or take, of the African American population being disenfranchised in Florida. But it's really not that, because it's so disproportionately male.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like 30%, like 1 in 3 eligible, I mean, voting age, 1 in 3 of the voting age population of African Americans in Florida, points in the 21st century, have been disenfranchised. I mean, that is just, I mean, I don't know about you, I found that a little mind blowing, and I've been looking at these numbers for a long time.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question, because it does appear that there is I guess, a reliance on prison labor. I mean, I think that's part of this issue. And I know here in California, there has been a lot of work at the legislative level to address or to put some controls around prison labor. which is, for the most part, free labor. I mean, you think about companies like, because again, I wanted to make sure I looked it up. Quite a few Fortune 500 companies use prison labor at some point in their supply chain. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Walmart, Tyson Foods, they all have this relationship. So when you look at what you just mentioned about the statistics, how people being locked up, and then what they're doing when they're incarcerated, in a sense, there is a substantial labor impact when folks are locked up. Is that not true?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. In fact, I mean, it's large enough that, mass incarceration is effectively operated as sort of like an underground labor market regulator, and not in a very good way. I mean, you talk about these corporations, and it's even governments. I mean, the state of California puts inmates to work on various things, fighting fires, for example. And some inmates do that out in California. But it's, the even if you look at this from a macro perspective, so if you're just taking a cold-blooded economic look at it, and you're saying, well, what we've got here is this big group of cheap labor, it doesn't really pay off for society in the long run because it's cheap labor while they're inside, but people get out. And even if they have acquired useful economic skills while they're in prison, they have a hard time, selling them competitively on the labor market because, sometimes you don't get a job just because you got a felony record.
Right.
And there are some jobs that effectively you are de jure legally barred from having. One of the examples I talk about in the book is, some of those inmates who fight fires for the Department of Corrections out in California. I mean, there is a demand for those skills in some states that, face severe wildfire problems, and there's a shortage of labor. And ex-convicts have a hard time landing those jobs because they are ex-convicts. And effectively, what that means is you've got a labor market where there is a demand for a skill, that skill is available, and the economy cannot put it to work because of this stigma, and in some cases, the law around hiring ex-felons. And I ran some numbers, and this actually has a macroeconomic effect. It can shave a couple of percentage points off of a state's gross state product, which, if you're talking about a state like California, that's the fifth largest economy in the world.
Right.
You're talking about some big numbers there. And this is one of the reasons why I titled the book The Jailer's Reckoning, is because there is a reckoning. There is a price that, not just people who are convicted and go to prison pay. It's everybody pays it, whether it's in the form of lower productivity and higher taxes, and lower social cohesion, whether it's in distorted electoral outcomes. We all pay that bill. It's not just limited to those who actually, serve some time behind bars.
We have a few minutes left, but I want to ask you now a process question because you referred to it a couple of times. There's so much data and analyses and spreadsheets. There's a lot of data out there about this issue. How did you synthesize all of that data, and how did you, get through all of it? And were there opportunities, or were there chances or things where you said, okay, maybe that's not? How did you means test the data? Because it's out there, but how did you make sure that the data was tested so that when you reported on it, it's actually accurate and true?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm so glad you asked it because I don't get that particular question a lot. How did I get through all the data and analyze all of it? I mean, the short answer to that is time.
Hmm.
I started working on this project in around 2013, 2014. There were three generations of graduate students who've served as my RAs here at Nebraska, who've been involved in collecting this data and running lit reviews and everything. So there's no substitute for time. And in terms of, sort of like validating the data, making sure that the numbers are reasonably trustworthy. I mean, I try to rely on sources that are widely used by academics. And the other thing is I sort of like, I have a very long methodological appendix that I've posted online that sort of like states, this is where I got this data from, and this is how I used it, and this is how the measure was created. And the reason that I very, very deliberately did this is I'm extremely conscious of the fact that whenever you do this sort of things, there's choices, right? You can measure a variable this way, you can measure it that way, you can use this data set, you can use that data set. And I want people to know what I did, where I got the data from, what I did with it. And if they want, I've got links to everything. They can follow up and do their own analyses. But I think that's a critical question. And one of the things that I'm really careful to say in the book is there's no statistical analysis that can prove that you're right. The best that you can hope for is that you are not, that you basically that you can be usefully wrong.
Right.
And that's really what I've shot for, is I have tried to be, as ironic as it sounds, I've tried to be usefully wrong, not to be, too off the mark on anything.
Last question for you. What do you want readers to take away from this book, and what is the call to action from this book?
Well, the key thing that I want people to take away from this book is a realization of what mass incarceration has done to us and to them specifically. To realize that this is not an issue that does not affect them. It is absolutely an issue that affects them. It affects them in terms of the elected leaders that they have. It affects them in terms of their pocketbook. It very may likely affect them in terms of the social capital in their community. So that is the one big takeaway. Then in terms of a call for action, this does sound a little ironic, but it's almost a call for inaction in the sense of being deliberate in terms of reacting to this issue when it comes up, especially in a political sense, but even in a conversational sense. A lot of people have sort of like a knee-jerk, not very thought-through response to these sorts of issues. And one of the things that I hope that the people who read this book will come away thinking, this is a little bit more complex and nuanced than I thought. And there is not really a solution, but there's a set of trade-offs. And we need to think really seriously about what trade-offs we want to accept.
Well, Kevin, I appreciate you coming on the Edric Show. The book is fascinating. There's so much information there. And thank you for synthesizing all of it, because there's a lot to chew on. And I applaud you for diving in and raising this issue. So thank you for that. If people want more information about you or the book, or how they can get a copy of the book, where can they go?
Well, the book is available for order at all the usual places, Amazon.com and Barnes and Noble, Powell's, those sorts of places. And if you want more information about me and the book, you can just go to my website, which is just kevinbsmith.com.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Kevin, I know people are clamoring to talk to you, so I don't want to hold you too long, but I do want to thank you for coming on the Edric Show, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. This has been another edition of the Edric Show. I am your host, Edric Jerome. As promised, this is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. My guest has been author Kevin B. Smith, author of the new book, The Jailer's Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and you'll get notified when I post content each and every week. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode.